I want to talk directly to the Rush fans who are still not convinced. Not the people who came to the Kia Forum opening night already won over. Not the people who watched the Juno Awards performance and immediately posted that she was incredible. Not Mike Portnoy who sat at home watching a live stream and cried. Not the new fans who discovered Rush through Anika Nilles' YouTube channel and are experiencing the catalog for the first time with fresh ears. I want to talk to the ones who are still sitting with this uncomfortably. The ones who've watched the footage and respected the technical ability and still felt something not quite right. The ones who think that maybe, regardless of how well Nilles plays, the whole premise of Rush continuing without Neil Peart is a category error. A wrong answer to a question that has no right answer. I've heard the argument. I think it deserves to be taken seriously, and I also think it deserves to be honestly challenged, not dismissed, not mocked, challenged. Because this is not a simple question. It is, in a lot of ways, one of the most interesting questions a devoted music fan can face. And the Rush fan base, famously, legendarily, one of the most intellectually engaged fan bases in rock music, deserves a real conversation about it rather than a celebration video that ignores the legitimate grief underneath the criticism. So, let's have it. First, let's steelman the purist position, because the people who are struggling with this aren't wrong to struggle with it, and the specific criticisms they raise deserve to be heard clearly before they're addressed. Criticism 1. Rush is a trio. Specifically, Rush is that trio. The three-way conversation between Geddy Lee's bass and vocal presence, Alex Lifeson's guitar architecture, and Neil Peart's drumming was not three independent instruments that happened to share a stage. It was a single, unified musical voice that could only exist as the sum of those three specific parts. When you change one of the three, you don't have Rush -1. You have something different. This is not a trivial objection. It's actually a serious musicological argument. Rush's sound, the specific way those songs breathe and move and surprise you, was built on the wordless conversation between three people who had been playing together since 1974. Peart didn't just know where Lee and Lifeson were going next, he helped decide where they were going. He shaped the songs. He was not a backing musician, he was a co-composer who happened to work with his limbs rather than his hands. Criticism 2. The overplaying critique. Some purists have argued that Nilles' jazz fusion background leads her to inject too much of her own personality into the parts. Philia Saya, that where Peart played with architectural precision and purposeful restraint, Nilles brings a more improvisational, expressive approach that changes the feel of the songs in subtle but real ways. This is also not a frivolous critique. Neil Peart was famous for never overplaying. His fills landed where they were supposed to land. His solos served the song. He once described drumming as orchestrating rather than soloing, which is why Rush fans can quote his fills the way other fans quote guitar riffs. They're not showing off, they're storytelling. Criticism 3. The deepest objection, beneath all the technical analysis. Going back on the road without Neil Peart is, for some fans, not a musical disappointment but something closer to a moral one. It feels like a violation of something. Like the band had made an implicit promise, was together, that this particular thing, the three of them together, was what Rush was, and continuing without it breaks that promise. That feeling is real. It comes from love. It deserves to be acknowledged. Here is something that almost never gets mentioned in the fan debate, and it should. Anika Nilles has been asked, in almost every major interview she's done since being announced as Rush's touring drummer, what the hardest part of the whole experience has been. Not learning the parts, which took months of intensive, total immersion work. Not the rehearsal process which, as Lifeson and Lee have described, involved its own anxious days when they weren't sure it was working. Not the stick drop during Xanadu on opening night. The hardest part, Nilles has said explicitly, was dealing with the fan criticism. The commentary before she ever played a note with Rush in public. The sections of the internet that had already decided she was wrong for the role before the Juno Awards performance, before the Kia Forum, before anyone outside a private rehearsal room in Canada had heard her play a single Rush song. She said that dealing with that criticism was far more difficult than learning Neil Peart's complex drum compositions. Think about what that means. A musician who had just spent months inside some of the most technically demanding drum parts in rock history, who had essentially restructured her entire practice routine to accommodate a different physical approach, said that the human judgment of strangers on the internet was harder than all of that. She's not saying this to generate sympathy, she's saying it because it's true, and because it reflects something real about what it costs to accept a role this loaded with other people's grief. The purists who criticized her before she played were not criticizing her drumming. They hadn't heard her play Rush. They were expressing grief. And grief, directed at a person rather than a loss, is one of the most unfair things human beings do to each other. Let's get specific about the overplaying critique, because it has a real example attached to it that's worth examining carefully. Rolling Stone's reviewer of the opening Kia Forum show noted that Nilles didn't always replicate Peart's parts to a microscopic level, and cited Subdivisions specifically as a moment where she subtly reinvented the drum part with her own feel. This is the moment purists point to. She changed something. She made a choice that Peart wouldn't have made. She put herself into a song that has a specific identity, built partly on what Neil Peart did in it. Is that wrong? Here's the counter-argument, and I think it's a strong one. Neil Peart famously never repeated himself. Anika Nilles herself described this in her classic rock interview, Set It Down. One of the most revealing things she said about what makes him so hard to honor properly. She said, "He rarely repeated himself. He kept bringing something new into the song. Even if a section repeated in terms of songwriting, his drumming the second time was different from the first. That makes it exciting and is part of what gives the songs their identity. Even if a section repeats in songwriting, he played it differently the second time through." Read that again. Neil Peart's defining characteristic, by Nilles' own analytical account, was that he kept changing what he was doing, that he refused to be locked into a single, fixed version of any part. That innovation, within structure, was the thing that gave the songs their life. So what does it mean to honor Neil Peart? Does it mean playing every note he played exactly as he played it, forever? Which is the one thing Neil Peart himself never did? Or does it mean approaching the music with the same creative intelligence and refusal to be merely mechanical that defined everything he played? Nilles chose the second interpretation, and it is, at minimum, a defensible reading of what Peart's own approach actually required. This is the real objection, and it can't be answered with music analysis. The question is not whether Anika Nilles is good enough. She clearly is. The question is whether the thing she's doing is Rush, and whether it matters if it isn't. Here is the most honest version of the purist argument. Some bands are their specific lineup. The Beatles without John Lennon is not the Beatles. Nirvana without Kurt Cobain is not Nirvana. And Rush without Neil Peart is not Rush, regardless of how good the replacement drummer is, regardless of how much of the catalog gets performed, regardless of how emotional the tribute videos are. This is a coherent position. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But here's what I'd push back on. The Beatles argument doesn't quite apply, because the Beatles broke up. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr made a choice not to continue as the Beatles after John died. The decision to stop was deliberate, and it was theirs to make. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson made a different choice. They are the surviving members of Rush. They built this music. They are the people most entitled in the world to decide what Rush is, and what Rush continues to mean. And they decided, after years of grief and private jamming, and a secret week in Canada, that the music deserved to keep being played. That a generation of fans who never got to see Rush live deserved a chance. That the songs, which are, as Rolling Stone put it, sturdy enough to hold the weight of grief, were built for more than one performance. That is their right, and it is worth remembering that Geddy Lee himself said, repeatedly, "Some people will never forgive us for going on with someone else." He knew the purists existed, he knew what they felt, he chose to go forward anyway. Not out of disrespect for Peart, but because he and Lifeson believed that silence was not the only way to honor him. After all the debate, after months of internet argument and competing camps and passionate positions on both sides, the shows happened. And the shows told us something. The Phoenix New Times sent a reviewer who had seen Rush 26 times. Someone whose parents had taken him to a Rush show in 1981 and who had never stopped going. Someone with more invested in this question than almost any casual observer could understand. His verdict, at the June 7th show, any concerns about Nilles have been put to rest, and she made short work of impressing devout Rush fans. Rolling Stone called her performance a combination of precision and snare-snapping brutality that evoked Peart's All the World's a Stage era, his most physically aggressive period. And in the same review, offered perhaps the most poetic description of what watching her play actually felt like. At times, the musical likeness was so uncanny that it evoked Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost, the spirit of the departed animating her limbs. The spirit of the departed animating her limbs. That is not a description of a replacement drummer. That is a description of a musician who has absorbed someone so completely that the connection to what came before is not severed, it's transmitted. And Grunge's review, summing up what the fan community had been finding in the aftermath of the opening run, identified something important underneath all the initial purist resistance. Much of the grumbling, it turns out, was leftover mourning for Peart and fear that the old magic could never return. Not opposition to Nilles. Fear that the thing they loved was gone forever, and that watching someone else play those parts would confirm it. The shows, apparently, did not confirm it. For most of the people who arrived with that fear, the shows offered something unexpected, the old magic, in a new form. Not the same, not a replacement, but not gone, either. Here's where I land on this. If you are a Rush fan who has decided that no version of Rush without Neil Peart is something you want to experience, that is a completely valid choice. That is your relationship with this music, and it belongs to you. Nobody is required to accept anything they're not ready to accept. Grief doesn't come with a deadline, but if the reason you're staying away is the overplaying critique, if the specific concern is that Nilles brings too much of herself to the parts, that the jazz fusion background creates a different feel, that she's not a precise enough facsimile of what Peart did, I gently ask you to sit with one question. Neil Peart himself never played the same part the same way twice. He changed things, he reinvented, he brought himself to every song, every night, and refused to be mechanical about it. The thing that made him the professor was not perfect replication. It was boundless, disciplined creativity. Anika Nilles, in approaching his music the only way she knows how, with her own hard-won musical voice applied carefully to his structural genius, may be doing something closer to what he actually valued than a note-perfect imitation ever could. That's not a certainty, it's a perspective, but it's one worth sitting with. Drop a comment. Where do you fall in this debate? Are you a purist, a supporter, or somewhere in the complicated middle? Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.